Hello everyone, today I'm going to teach you the useEffect hook. Now the useEffect hook can be used to react to state changes or rendering changes. Now rendering changes usually happen whenever you update state. So whenever you call setState, the component will re-render. And each time the component re-renders, useEffect will be executed. Now I'm going to show you a small example of how to use useEffect. Now in our simple app, we're gonna create a useEffect hook, and so I'm gonna remove all the stuff created by the snippet for now because we don't need it. Now useEffect is a simple hook. You can import it from React, and all it takes is a simple callback function. Now we have a useEffect that's empty, it doesn't do anything. So now, like for example, what useEffect does is whenever the component loads, this is gonna run whatever is inside the callback function. So for example, if I console log component rendered, right? Now, if I go back to my app, you can see the effect of this. So I'm gonna go to my console. You can see that it says component rendered. Now the reason it's shown twice is because of React strict mode. See, for example, if I comment out React strict mode, it's only gonna be logged once, as you can see. Now I recommend you keep strict mode on because it's only useful in development. It doesn't actually do anything in production, but it helps you catch bugs in development, such as memory leaks. Now I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna show you again. Like I said, the reason this runs again is because in strict mode, effects are run twice intentionally just for debugging purposes. This helps you detect bugs in your application. Now you can see that this ran twice, and now, like I said, the effects are ran each time the component re-renders, and the component usually re-renders whenever state updates happen. So in case of a state update, we have this toggle. Now each time I toggle this, the to-do state is going to be updated. So when I click this, the component rendered should log. So I'm going to click, and as you can see, component rendered has been logged. I'm going to click it again, it's logged. So useEffects are ran whenever the component re-renders. Now what are the common use cases for useEffect? Now for example, in this case, we can actually use it to track and show the user each time the component re-renders, but this is not really a valid use case. You're never going to use this. So for example, another cool use case is if I had now a counter state, right? Use count, it's going to be 0. And I'm going to create a button. And each time I click this, I'm going to increment the count by 1, right? So set count equals count plus 1, right? I'm going to go back, I'm going to refresh, and whenever I click the count, it's going to say component rendered. But now I'm actually going to change the message. I'm going to say console log count is count. So each time we update the count, we're going to console log the new count. As you can see, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. Now, useEffect is pretty cool if you want to react to state changes. And this is how you do it. It's pretty simple. And now one thing you should always avoid is setting state inside of a useEffect. So you shouldn't call set state inside an effect. And the reason for that is it will most likely cause an infinite loop most of the time. Because like I said, so inside of useEffect runs each time the component re-renders, and re-renders are called by state updates. So if you set state inside of useEffect, that will cause a state update, and that will in turn cause useEffect to run. And again, it will set the state, which will again cause the component to re-render, and useEffect will be run again. So it's going to be an infinite loop. And I'm going to show you what this looks like in practice. So let's say each time there's a state update, we're going to set the count. But don't forget that useEffect by default runs whenever the component mounts for the first time. So this is going to get run the moment the component finishes rendering. So I don't have to click this or do any state updates for useEffect to run. So now the moment the component mounts, it will call setCount, and you will see what this is going to cause. In fact, you can even see like this ESlint rule telling us that we shouldn't call setCount without a dependencies because it will cause an infinite loop. I'll tell you what dependencies are, but in our case, I'm going to refresh, and you can see it's already running. So you can see like it's infinitely running. So each time we call setCount, the component re-renders, and useEffect is run again, which causes setCount again, re-renders, setCount, re-render, which is an infinite loop. Now I'm gonna comment this out, and it should stop. Okay. And as you can see, like you should always avoid just setting state inside of useEffect in general, because most of the time you can get it wrong and cause an infinite loop. Now I'm going to remove this set count because, like I said, you should pretty much never set state inside of a useEffect. Okay, so now, as you can see, like I said previously, this effect will run each time the component renders. Okay, now sometimes we don't want an effect to run all the time. We only want it to run when certain information happens. So in this case, we only care about the count. So this effect should run only when the count runs. Now I'm gonna make this more easy to understand. So I'm gonna create two effects, one that will log whenever the component renders, and one that will log whenever the count updates. So right now, by default, both will run all the time. So if I toggle this stuff, both are gonna run. And if I toggle count, both are gonna run. So right now I separated both effects into different ones. So this one will run whenever the component renders, and this one will also run whenever the component renders, but this one will console log component rendered, and this one will log the count. Okay. Now we do have a different piece of state, which is the new to do, which is this input. Now I'm gonna create an effect that actually tracks whenever the input changes. So it's gonna be input is, and I'm gonna call this new input, or it's called new to do. Okay, so right now we have three effects, right? One that will run and tell us that the component rendered, another will tell us what the count is, and another will tell us what the input is. I'm gonna go back, gonna refresh. And like I said, each time I update, for example, the to-do, this will set the state and it will cause the entire component to re-render. So I'm going to do some updates, and you can see each time I update the state, the component re-renders, and all of these three are run. I'm going to delete this, and also with the count as well. But you can see the problem now is, so even though the count is the only thing that was updated, the input is also being logged, which obviously doesn't seem very efficient, since only one thing changed. So one way to avoid this, or like fix this, make it more efficient, is to use dependencies. Now the way to do this is useEffect takes two arguments. The first thing is this callback function, and the second thing is the dependencies array. So I will show you what the dependency array does. I'm gonna comment these out for now, and right now I'm gonna pass a second element, and it's gonna be an empty array. Now, if I go back to my app and refresh, well, you can see that the component rendered ran, but when I update the count, you can see all the to do, you can see that it's not being logged again. So what this does is this array basically tells this effect to only run when elements inside of this array change. And since this is an empty array, the useEffect will only run once and never again. So this basically tells it to only run the first time the component renders and then never again. Now, how is this useful to us? Well, this is useful for us, for example, in the case of the count. Like I said, each of these effects run whenever one of these changes, either the new to do or the count, so both always run. But like I said, we only want to run this count console log whenever the count changes. So to fix this, we pass an array, but this time it's not empty. We actually want to pass the count. So what this tells the effect is only run this code whenever the count updates. And the same thing goes for the to do. So I'm going to pass an array. I'm going to call it new to do. Well, this is the name of the variable for our state. Okay, one sec. And yeah. So right now, this will only run whenever count updates, and this will only run whenever new to do updates. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to refresh. So I'm going to update the count. You can see right now only the count is being logged. When I update the to do, you can see that the to do is the only thing that's being logged. So this is the way to control your effects, and you can have as many effects as you want in your components. This is actually always better to have separate effects for separate things. You should avoid having one effect that has a bunch of logic inside of it that's unrelated. So for example, I'm going to have an effect here that does stuff whenever the count updates, and I'm going to have a different effect for whenever the new to do updates. And by the way, like I told you, we have ESlint set up. So for example, if I set this as an empty array, well, actually ESlint detects this, and it says that useEffect has a missing dependency count, either include it or remove the array. Now, it does this because it analyzes the content of our effect, and when it detects that we're actually using a piece of state from our app, such as this one, it automatically suggests that you add it to the array, because most of the time, whenever you use an external variable inside an effect, you should almost always include it in the array, because this way you can avoid having outdated versions of the variables. Now I'm going to console log this once more. Now I understand that this useEffect seems a bit complicated, but it's very important that you understand how this works, because useEffect is a very important building block of React. Now, like I said, I'm going to do a small recap. So if you type in useEffect without an array, it will run each time the component re-renders. And if you add an empty array, it will only run for the first time it renders. And if you add state or elements inside of the array, it will only run whenever these dependencies change. So in this case, this will only run whenever the count changes. And in this case, it will only run whenever the new to do changes. Now this is useEffect. If you want to learn more about it, you can check out the official documentation. They do go pretty in depth about this. And this is actually a pretty cool use case for useEffect. So for example, we're going to have a state for a URL. And whenever that URL changes, we're going to create a new connection for a chat room, for example. You can think this as a WhatsApp group. So whenever the URL of the server changes, we're going to create a new connection. And one thing is that useEffect has a return function that you can actually return a cleanup function. So in this case, you can see that we create a connection. We take that connection and then we actually connect to the server. But for example, what happens if we go to a new page and this component is no longer being rendered? Well, the problem is if we don't have this return and we include a disconnect, the connection will actually stay, which means whenever we change pages, we will actually create a new connection without killing the existing one. So this will result in a memory leak, as in we will have a bunch of connections being added without actually being removed. So this return basically tells the effect to disconnect whenever the component is unmounted or whenever the component is removed from the screen, basically. Like I said, if you have a website, for example, a social media website, you have a chat page and you have a social status page. Well, if you go to the chat page, we will create a connection. And if we leave that page and we don't include the disconnect, actually the connection will stay. And if we go back to the chat page, it will actually create a new connection. So if we go back and forth 10 times, we're going to have 10 different connections. And as you can see, this will actually cause the memory usage to increase and make our app slower. And when we include this disconnect on the useEffect return, this means that whenever we navigate away from the chat page, the connection will actually be killed. And when we navigate back to the chat page, a new connection will be created, and when we navigate away, the connection will be killed. And this will help us avoid creating memory leaks. Now, a brief explanation of memory leaks is if you've ever used a browser or an application that seems to slowly use more RAM as you use it, but you don't really do anything. So for example, if you have one single website open and you notice that the memory is increasing, then that's usually a memory leak, which means the program isn't managing its memory very efficiently. And yeah, so this is useEffect. You should be very careful when using it. Like I said, there are a bunch of gotchas with it, as in never use set state inside of useEffect, because that will usually cause an infinite loop. And always include the dependencies array, because pretty much most of the time you're gonna need to control when the effect runs. And yeah, so that's how useEffect works. I hope my explanation was good, and if there's anything that's not clear, you can always leave a comment and I'll reply. So yeah, see you in my next video.